When we're young, we have an amazing, positive outlook about how great life is going to be, but somewhere along the line, we forget to dream and end up settling. Join Up Dots features amazing people who refuse to give up and chose to go after their dreams. This is your blueprint for greatness. So here's your host, live from the back of his garden in the UK, David Ralph.
Yes, hello there. Good morning, everybody in Join Up Dots land. Good morning. How are you? I hope you're ready. I hope you're ready for a good day's work if you're going to work, or if you've got the dream and you're just laying on a bed while a beautiful person drops grapes in your mouth. I hope you enjoy that at the same time as listening to today's show, because he is today's guest and he's got one of those kind of stories that you think, should I go this way? Should I go that way? Or should I just plow into it? So I'm going to just plow into it because he is a man who connected with the show by email asking to appear, and believe me, we get so many of them nowadays that sometimes you don't give them quite the focus that perhaps you should. But this wasn't the case with today's guest, who hit us with, I've lived in the South Pole for 13 months. He probably hasn't got that voice, but I've lived in the South Pole for 13 months. My life is an ongoing adventure with worldly experiences, including, but not limited to, having spent 22 months underwater on nuclear submarines, 13 months at the geographic South Pole conducting atmospheric research, 3 years shipboard in the Arctic, and 1 year shipboard on the equator conducting ocean floor studies. I've written extensively on terrorism and related subjects and authored the best-selling current events book, The Chicken Little Agenda, Debunking Experts' Lies, wherein I assure your listening audience that the sky is not falling. Now, he's an established author who, in his own words, has spent nearly my entire life off the beaten path. So with a history like that, where do we start first? And what does he tell people? He's an author, adventurer, or someone simply living a life on his own terms? Well, let's find out as we bring onto the show to start joining up dots with the one and only Dr. Robert Williscroft. Good morning, Dr. Robert. How are you, sir?
I am just fine, thank you.
It is great to have you on because you have got one of those stories that literally could go anywhere. I could take you underwater in a submarine. I could have you building snowmen on the North Pole. When you look back at your life, do you kind of go, yeah, it was a plan. It was a master plan that I brought to fruition. Or, hang on, I can't believe it myself.
Well, it's more the second than the first. It's like riding a merry-go-round, and every time you come around, the brass ring is there, and so you grab it.
And is it as simple as the fact you just sort of reach around and think that looks fun, jump at it and grab hold?
Yep, very much that.
But does that not wind you up? Because I know so many people in the world would hate that. They like routine, they like structure, they like that the alarm clock goes off at 6:42 and they lay there till 6:45 before they get out of bed, and when they have their shower. You're somebody that just lives life on the terms that is given to you at that moment.
I spent a good deal of my life following a routine. The military is a routine organization. Riding a submarine, living on a submarine is filled with routine, watchstanding, and other boring things, but always interrupted by moments of sheer panic.
Well, I can imagine that's the case, but I think a submarine would be terribly boring all the time. As soon as it goes under the water, it's just, I don't think I could do it for more than an hour. I think the feeling of, I've got to get out of here would drive me mental. So what's the exciting things on a submarine then?
Well, for example, I was standing watch, mid-watch, that is from midnight till 6 in the morning. My sonar tech contacted me and he said, I think we have a contact with submerged cavitation, suppressed cavitation, and that to a submariner means it's probably another submarine out there. Well, that in itself is interesting, but then he came back to me a couple of minutes later and he said, this contact isn't varying its relative bearing to us, and he's getting closer, which means we're on a collision course, although we could have been at different depths from each other. But here's a submarine out in the middle of the ocean in an area where we would expect Soviet submarines to be, and he's on a collision course with us. We paid a little bit of attention to it, and then he suddenly called me back and said, this guy's a lot closer than I thought. And at that moment, I realized I had a decision to make. I took the submarine into a sharp left dive took the speed up to flank speed, rolled the commanding officer, rolled the skipper out of his bunk onto the deck, and shortly thereafter, through the hull, we heard this submarine pass down our side.
And what was it? What was it? Was it a Russian? Was it a Russian?
Well,
or
we
us.
reconstructed it. We actually reconstructed it after the fact. Yes, it was a Russian fast attack submarine. It was moving along so fast. He was moving at 15 knots. He couldn't hear himself. He couldn't hear anything. All he could hear was noise. He didn't know we were there until we turned left, and our screws, our propeller was shorts. And he immediately turned to the left and up, and so we separated and got out of each other's hair. But it was a huge surprise for him, and that's the kind of panic I talk about that comes out of nowhere, and boom, you've got to take action right now.
And does that help in a sort of entrepreneurial sense when you're making decisions based on gut instinct? Because, a lot of people would have just frozen at that point or handed it over to somebody else or a myriad of things, but you made a decision that turned out to be right. Is that sort of how you operate on a daily basis in your own entrepreneurial life?
I think so. One of the things that submarining gave me was the ability to make correct decisions very quickly, because if you don't make a correct decision, you never make another one in your life. You die. So you learn very quickly. There's a lot of training. The commanding officer spends a lot of time looking at his officers and working with them and training the men to the point where they can respond properly, because he can't be there all the time. He's got to sleep. He's got to do things that carry on his responsibilities, and that's why he has his officer crew and his enlisted crew who run the machines and keep the submarine functioning and in fighting condition. But throughout my life, I have found myself with the ability to make a decision, and while it hasn't always been absolutely the best decision, I'm here to tell you about it, so it couldn't have been too wrong.
No, that's right. So how have you developed this? Because this is a stumbling block. We see this in entrepreneurial life, that people have an idea and they can't even get past the first point. They're in analysis paralysis, as they say. How have you managed to get this skill fine-tuned where you make a decision and you work with it?
Well, I started off as an enlisted sonar technician on submarines. You and your listeners have seen the movie or read the book, The Hunt for Red October.
Yes.
If you have, you might remember Jonesy. In the movie, he was a precocious, dark-skinned sonar tech. Well, I was Jonesy in every respect except maybe for my skin color. Precocious and in your face and smart and loving my job. I got picked for a commissioning program and sent to University of Washington to get my degree, and then I came back into submarines. And so when I went aboard, the old man, the captain, he knew that he had a bright lad, a young officer under his wing, and so he spent a lot of time with me. I would be up on the bridge. It wasn't just me, it's the other officers too, but I would be up there standing watch, and the captain would be right there, and he would be quizzing me almost continuously. Well, what would you do under these circumstances? How would you handle this? If we were in a position where I could make a mistake without hazarding the ship, he'd let me make the mistake and then give me the wherewithal for what I had done and why, and get me on the right track. So the entire time out there was a training mode from the captain's point of view, and he honed me and the other guys to the point where we could make the decisions correctly.
So looking at your life as you are now, what do you describe yourself in? As we said in the introduction, are you an author? Are you a doctor? What would you do? If you're in a bar and a lovely lady comes up and you brush your hair down, looking your best, what would you describe yourself as?
Well, the first thing I would describe myself as married to the girl of my dreams. But
she's not there. Yeah, in this scenario, she's not there. You're free to do whatever you want, Dr. Robert.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It really depends. People are fascinated by the fact that I spent 13 months at the South Pole, so that is certainly something that I can have fun with. And then when I mentioned that I spent 3 years up in the Arctic and bumped into the North Pole and spent a lot of time underwater, people either say, yeah, right. Or they find it fascinating and start asking questions, and it just kind of goes the way this interview is going right here. It just goes in whatever direction it wants to go.
But what do you call yourself? That's what I want to know. Do you say you're an author? Do you say you're an adventurer? What would you say?
Yeah, I'm an author. I'm an adventurer. I suppose more than anything else at this stage of my life, I like to call myself an author, or maybe an author adventurer.
Oh, I like what you did there. You merged the two together to create intrigue, which has led me into a question is because your Chicken Little agenda, that's one of the reasons why we got you on the show, debunking expert lies. Now, I kind of like expert lies, or as we say nowadays, it's fake news, which is, I think, it's a brilliant way of pushing anything you don't like out the window. My kids come up to me now and they say, "Why did you say that, Dad?" And I go, "It was fake news." And I just walk away from it. I'm free. This is brilliant. So when you look at old Trumpy boy, for example, doing his fake news, do you think to yourself, that would be perfect for my expert lies? Because not everything can be fake news, can it?
Yeah, you have a very good point. And let me tell you how this whole thing came about, because it illustrates, I think, a major point in anybody's life. I had come back from the South Pole. I retired from the military shortly thereafter, and I was living in a small town in eastern Washington State, in the northwestern part of the United States. The town only had 2,500 people, and everybody knew that I was kind of somebody different from your average wheat farmer out there. And I had an office and was running a small company. People would come into my office every day, a farmer in his overalls and his checkered shirt, and he'd toss a paper on my desk and sit down and say, "Hey, Robert," or "Hey, Doc, what's this?" And he'd show me an article, and I'd look at it, and sure enough, he'd say, "That doesn't make sense." Usually the guy was right. It didn't make sense. Somebody was out there creating fake news. Someone was out there saying something that fit their own agenda, and it began to pick up the veneer of news, and it really wasn't. And so I'd explain it, and he'd walk out saying, "Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, I was right." And it became obvious that there was a newspaper column in what I was doing. And so I started writing for the local regional newspapers, and I ended up being syndicated around the Pacific Northwest, writing, basically explaining what was really going on. So the bottom line was this. I lived in a community that was made up of people with a lot of street smarts, a lot of common sense. Not necessarily formal education, but they were very good at what they did, and they certainly knew when somebody was trying to pull the wool over their eyes, even if they didn't have all the facts. And what I did was help them with the facts, with explanations that delved into my background and my expertise, and allowed them to see that the sky wasn't falling, that they weren't going to suffocate from CO2, or radiation wasn't going to kill them tomorrow. And these columns were quite popular. And 2 or 3 years after the sequence of columns began, a friend approached me and said, "You know something? You got a book here." And as it turned out, I did. We put the columns together, updated those that needed updating, tied them together and linked them with the Chicken Little concept, and the book was born.
So would you jump back and call it fake news now, or the Chicken Little agenda, is that perfect for you?
I really like the Chicken Little agenda. I think everyone's familiar with the story of Chicken Little, who gets hit on the head by an acorn and starts running through the barnyard yelling, "The sky is falling," and the entire barnyard begins to follow, afraid that the world is ending. And that is very much what's happening out there. When I started the series back in the 1980s, when the book was published in the 2000s, and today with the American presidency, with the former administration, and with things that have happened in Great Britain and throughout Europe, the sky isn't falling. We have some problems, but we can deal with them, and we're damn sure smarter than a lot of people out there who are trying to bring us down. And what we need to do is to concentrate on what really is going on rather than this person's agenda or that person's agenda. And that's what it's about.
So we're going to just finish up with Donald because he fascinates me for so many different ways, and most of them aren't good. When he stands up and he says that is fake news, just before we move on, does the world go, "You're wrong, Donald," or do they buy into him? Are people at that point where they actually go, "Well, it's the president, he must be right"? What do you think?
Well, going back to the guys who walked into my office and dropped the newspaper on my desk and said, "What's this all about?" I think, at least here in our country, here in America, most people of the type that I dealt with look at our president and they evaluate what he says, and a lot of them like him. A lot of people like what he says, and they're willing to excuse some of the bombast because that simply comes with the territory. And when the president says, "Well, that's fake news," they'll look at it and say, "Well, is it?" And in my experience in the last few months, I have to say that a lot of it has been, because there's such a concerted attack, a concerted effort to embarrass this new administration. It's kind of amazing looked at from the inside here.
I think it's even more amazing from the outside because, we can kind of walk away from it. So let's talk about expert lies then. So in your book, you're debunking expert lies. Now, where were your targets? Did the targets come to you naturally, or did you go looking for them? What kind of lies did you go for?
Well, that's a good question, because really it was from both directions. For example, allow me to read a couple of paragraphs from the book on the green agenda, and you'll see how it ties together.
Go for it.
Reading now. The Greens are a loosely knit group of people that is being led by a smaller cadre of ideologues who learn social science from Marx and physical science from popular science writers. On this shaky foundation, they have built an anti-freedom, anti-democratic, anti-science worldview. From Marx, they learned about the collective, the dialectic, and centralized control without understanding the lessons from current history following the breakup of the Soviet Union and the worldwide collapse of communism. From the life sciences, they learned about a connection between chemicals and cancer without understanding the nature of minute dangers and minuscule concentrations, or how they translate from the researcher's micro world to the macro world in which we live. From physics and the highly non-intuitive implications of relativity and quantum mechanics, they learned that reality is not always what it seems to be. With the help of several misguided physicists, they drew misinformed analogies to Eastern mysticism, connections that reinforced their radically subjective and intuitive, contrasted with experimental and scientific, approach to deep ecology. From a marriage of Marxist theory with a misunderstanding of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that total energy in the universe never increases, they developed a political economic system that incorporates no private land ownership and the principle of never expanding energy. From a misapplication of quantum physics, they derived a new world order that denies the cause and effect of market economics. From scientist ecologists, they gained a superficial understanding of the oneness of global processes and the living earth. Out of metaphor, they created reality. The living earth became a goddess.
Right. Well, I struggled to keep up with that, to be honest. I was focusing in on that. Give it to us in layman's terms. I might be the stupidest person on the planet, but there might be somebody out there joining me in this. Explain that to us.
Okay. Very simply, at the turn of the 20th century, when relativity and quantum mechanics came into being, a group of young physicists who would very much fit the mold of some of the progressive political folks today decided that because cause and effect didn't work the way they thought it did at the micro level in the subatomic world, that it didn't work in the world we live in the macro world either. And so they went about lecturing that everything is relative. There is no good, there is no evil, there is no right, there is no wrong. And in the process of doing this, and in the process of misunderstanding biology, they ended up misunderstanding how the world functions, so that today, when you talk to a young person in college here in the United States, and I suspect in England as well, and ask them about economics and the cause and effect of economic policy when a government begins to interfere in the economic process, they haven't a clue, no understanding whatsoever. And they created this green agenda that has been so destructive to the world. And it's amazing. They are experts, genuine experts, in the sense that they have a fine education and they have very deep knowledge in certain areas, but they misapply it to areas where they don't have a clue.
Right, so what we're saying is that the experts out there have got a good enough knowledge to express a theory, but it doesn't actually mean that the theory is going to be correct in the wider sense. Is that what we're saying?
Very much so. And it's interesting that you bring up the world theory, because one of the things that I discuss in the book, it's a very fun section, is that the word theory, as you and I use it conversationally, we all understand what it is. Well, that's just a theory. That isn't fact. That's somebody's idea about what might be. Yet when a scientist uses theory, it means something completely different. When he uses when he uses a word that describes what you and I call theory in the normal sense, it's a hypothesis. A theory is the peak. It is the final determination of experimentation. So when you have the theory of relativity, or the theory of evolution, or the theory of gravity, that is the fine-tuned peak. It has been fully defined, fully understood, and that's the top of the pile, not the bottom. So scientists will use the word theory, the layman will hear it and completely misunderstand what the scientist means.
So they're saying it's the fact of relativity. So we should just go, well, that's it. It's given.
Basically, yes, Although very few scientists would use the word fact, because that goes one step beyond. And just like Lord Rutherford back in the late 1800s made a comment that we've learned everything there is to learn about physics, and we can go on to other sciences. And just a few years later, Einstein developed the theory of relativity, and Max Planck and others developed quantum mechanics, and the whole world of physics was completely turned upside down. So no physicist worth his salt is going to say absolute fact. But yeah, as far as we know and as far as we can understand, relativity is pretty solid.
So with all your research that you've spent years and years and years doing, do you end up knowing less than you started with? Because it's a case that when you're younger, it's very much black and white. And as you get older, you start going into areas of grey where you kind of think, oh, yeah, I can see your point. I still don't quite get it. I imagine with that much knowledge, I'd be walking around going, I used to know this stuff, but now I'm just not sure on anything I'm looking at.
Yeah, that is a remarkable fact. We've got twins, twin boys. They are very, very bright. One is a merit scholar at University of Oklahoma studying paleontology, and the other is at the Colorado School of Mines studying computer science. We would sit around the dinner table when the boys are at home and have these esoteric discussions about things like we're talking about now, but at a more technical level. And it's been interesting to watch the boys as their certainty grows. And then with increasing knowledge, they're both of them just became juniors. With increasing knowledge, even though it isn't at the same level that mine is, to watch some uncertainty begin to creep in. Yeah, so you nailed it.
So what we should say is we should stop reading, we should stop looking at websites and just make it up as we go along. Do you think?
You know, given what's going on out there, while I understand the tongue-in-cheek nature of your question, there's some truth to that, because some of the, using the word as we normally use it, some of the theories being cast about have no more relationship to reality than dreams and myths.
Because you started off this conversation with talking about the merry-go-round, and you just grab hold of a ring and you sort of deal with that situation that comes with us. I think that's how you have to operate generally in life. I think people that have a plan A miss out a lot. But then again, people that have a plan B miss out on a lot as well, because they don't just focus on the plan A. Well, what do you think people should do to really create the dream life? Should they just go with the flow? Should they have multiple plans? What do you reckon, Dr. Robert? You could change lives here.
Well, the most important thing is to be prepared. I don't mean for plan A or plan B. I mean, be prepared for anything. Know about as much as you can, learn as much as you can, read as much as you can, talk to people as much as you can, especially those who know more than you do. And let me give you an example from my own personal experience of how important that can be. At the South Pole, while I was the lead researcher for atmospheric sciences down there, my secondary job was fire marshal for the station. Now there were a total of 17 of us in isolation for 9 months during the Antarctic winter, when we were completely cut off from the rest of the world except for shortwave radio. And among other things, we practiced our firefighting skills to keep us active and participating, but also in case we had a fire somewhere. And we had drilled in every area of the South Pole Station except the fuel storage area. The fuel storage area had great big rubber bladders filled with a special type of modified diesel fuel to run our engines to give us power. And we had tried to burn this fuel by putting it in buckets and hitting it with blowtorches. The stuff just wouldn't burn. It was too darn cold. We actually hit 117.8 degrees below zero while I was there. Anyway, finally, as fire marshal, I began to have a guilty conscience because we hadn't drilled in the area where the fuel was stored. And so we spent a full day, we set up for it, we spent a full day practicing how we might put out a fire there. One of the things we knew, for example, was that if the fuel were to burn, there'd be a lot of black smoke and we wouldn't be able to see. So we took our Scott air packs and we put black construction paper inside the face mask so that we had to do everything by touch and feel, just practicing. So we kind of brainstormed the best things that we could do. We discovered, for example, in the process that the Scott air packs, if they were stored outside, would freeze up after 2 or 3 minutes and we wouldn't be able to breathe anymore. And so we learned that we had to store them inside where they were warm, and that gave us maybe 15 minutes of air. Well, about a week later, I was sitting in my lab doing some work, and the fire alarm went off. And shortly thereafter, the station manager came up on the system and said, folks, this is real. The alarm is from the fuel area. We don't know what's going on yet, but get yourselves together. We got to do something. Well, I was about 100 meters upwind of the station. I got my clothes on, which took about 5 minutes, and then I ran. Now, the South Pole's at 10,000 feet of altitude, so running at 10,000 feet is a task on its own, and I was loaded down with the heavy-duty cold weather clothing, but I ran the 100 yards to the end of the fuel arch where the Quonset, where the fuel was stored. I opened the door, or rather I turned the handle on the door, and the door blasted me, knocked me on my back, and black smoke came billowing out. Well, I slammed the door shut with my feet, ran another 100 yards to the main entrance of the station and got in there. The fellas were all ready to go. We had everything set up. We had practiced. We knew what to do because we just practiced a week before. We got in there, and it was one of the fuel bladders, 10,000 gallons of fuel, was on fire, and we were going to die if we didn't solve this problem because nobody could help us, just the 17 of us. We managed to get it out. I won't go into all the details, but we got it out. And the bottom line was that we had serendipitously practiced a week earlier. Having practiced, we knew what to do. And we sat down and analyzed it afterwards. And if we had taken just a little bit longer, we believe that the fire would have consumed the oxygen inside the Quonset archway, but everything would have been very hot in there. And when we opened the door, it would have been hit with oxygen. The whole thing would have exploded. It would have been funneled directly at us, and every one of us would have been killed in the explosion, except for our female cook, who was a little ways away, and the 18-year-old radio operator who was keeping McMurdo Sound informed as to what was happening, and they couldn't survive by themselves. So there's an example of we couldn't possibly have predicted what would have happened, but we grabbed the ring the first time it came around. We did the practicing. We prepared ourselves. We made sure that we were able to handle what might come, and we survived.
So fail to prepare, prepare to fail. That is what we're summarizing that as?
You might say that, yeah. Just like the captain on the submarine drilled me incessantly. I drilled the people that worked for me incessantly. We came up with all kinds of scenarios of what might happen so that when something did happen, we didn't have to think about it. We could go into automatic and handle it.
It's been years since I drilled anyone, I tell you. So I'm taking this knowledge. And you're going to change my life on this. So when you look back on everything, where is the experience or the adventure or whatever that really you think, yeah, when I'm laying on my deathbed, that's the thing that's going to come back to me. That was the moment. That was the experience.
My goodness. There are so many of them, it's really hard to say. I would prefer not to think of myself as dying on my deathbed. I think I would rather, when I go, and I guess we all have to at some point, although I'm putting mine off as long as possible, when I go, I guess I would like it to be in the middle of some sort of amazing adventure.
Like what? Give us an example of the demise of Dr. Robert, and we can see whether you planned it. When we read the news, we go, oh, we heard this occurred on a podcast.
Well, when you brought up the story of the bar, and you brought up the idea of how I would describe myself to that attractive young woman who seemed fascinated by whatever it was that I was able to present myself as, well, I suppose one scenario would be to follow through on that and expire at the appropriate point.
You dirty man. You could have done anything, and you went in the same way that probably 99% of men would have gone with. That is one of those things, though, isn't it? That when on your deathbed, I remember saying to my dad, once, if you were on your deathbed, what would be your last wish? And he said that I wasn't dying. And it was as simple as that. And I thought to myself, is that good enough? Should we be thinking bigger than that? What are we filling our days up with? So did you go to bed every night thinking, I've had a jam-packed day, or do you just go to bed thinking that was a day? That was a day, probably be the same as tomorrow and the day after that?
Well, typically I go to bed having had a fulfilling day and looking forward to whatever might happen the next.
Come on, you can give me more than that. You speak in like sound clips, Dr. Robert. So you go to bed, and do you just go, oh, that was amazing, and you turn next to your girlfriend and then your wife who's on the other side, and you say to the two of them, God, I'll tell you what I did today, or are you just kind of just going with the flow?
Well, I'm one of these guys who can go to sleep in 10 seconds. So typically what I do is when I lie down, I go to sleep, but my mind keeps working. I'm in the middle of the third novel in a series that I've been writing called the Star Child series, and the pieces of this story kind of have a life of their own, and they swirl in my mind. And part of the story gets written while I'm asleep, so that when I wake up, I have to sit down at my computer screen and get some of the pieces together so that the flow continues. And that is a huge adventure in itself, because while I know the general structure of the story and I know where I want it to go, because it has a life of its own, it sometimes takes off and goes in a different direction. And it's an awful lot of fun to see where it takes me.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's like doing these shows. I never know where they're going to go. Sometimes they go like a rocket, sometimes not. You just never know. You just have to go with it. So just before we send you back in time on the Sermon on the Mic to give advice to your younger self, what is your favourite lie of all time? When you've debunked, what's the one that you go, actually, I know I've debunked this, but I quite like this. This is a good lie.
Wow. I think maybe the dangers of radiation. I remember that I lived on a nuclear submarine within dozens of feet of a nuclear reactor. My job on the submarine as an officer was the missile officer, and I literally embraced hydrogen bombs every day as I maintained them and kept an eye on them. And during that time, my radiation count on the monitors that we all carried was lower than people who just live out on the surface of the Earth, because we were protected from radiation from space inside the submarine, and there was no radiation from the reactor and from the bombs. People are so frightened of radiation, and yet they go out and they get a suntan and they don't realize that's radiation. People walk underneath an exit sign in a movie theater and they're bombarded with radiation from the americium that's in the exit sign. But they don't realize that. A pound of coffee irradiates people, but they don't realize that. So I think maybe the concept of what radiation is the one of the biggest lies out there, and one that fascinates me the most.
I think I'm going to ask Marie Curie that question when she's next on my show, because I think she'll have a different point of view on that.
Well, back when she was doing her thing, people didn't understand the nature of radiation. And as a result, they didn't realize some of the dangers involved in acute radiation. But to explain, radiation, typically radioactivity is measured in becquerels, and 1 becquerel is the equivalent of 1 atomic disintegration per second. So a kilogram of coffee has 1,000 becquerels. That means 1,000 atomic disintegrations a second. A human being, you sitting right there in front of your mic, you have 7,000 becquerels. You're putting out 7,000 atomic disintegrations a second, just you sitting there in front of your mic. So the smoke detector that you probably have in the room puts out 30,000 becquerels per second. So the nature of radiation is way different from what Madame Curie came up with, although she was one of the few people at the beginning who had a better understanding of what it's all about.
She knew her stuff. And she's my favourite expert. When you ask me who my favourite radiation expert is, it's her. It's her all the way. It's got to be, isn't it?
I agree with you. Yeah, she was quite a lady.
Right, okay, well, this is the part of the show that we've been building up to, and this is the Sermon on the Mic, when we send you back in time to have a one-on-one with your younger self. And if you could go back in time and speak to the young Dr. Robert, what age would you choose and what advice would you like to give? Well, we're going to find out, because I'm going to play the theme, and when it fades, you're up. This is the Sermon on the Mic.
Here we go with the best bit of the show, the Sermon on the Mic, the Sermon on the Mic.
Well, it's an interesting question. I had mentioned as an oh, by the way, a little bit earlier, that I have the good fortune to have found and married the girl of my dreams. I met her when I came back from the South Pole back in the 1980s, but I didn't marry her until 27 years later. And when I look at my earlier self and I ask myself, what could I have done differently? Well, there are tens of thousands of things that I could tell myself to do things differently, but every single one of them leads me away from having finally connected with the girl of my dreams. So it's a tough question for me to address. I guess if I set that aside and simply look at it from a personal perspective, when I was a late teenager, I didn't have a mentor, and as a result, I was floundering. I would go this direction, then I would go that direction. I would concentrate on this, and I would concentrate on that, and I didn't have a sense of what I needed to do to really prepare myself for the inevitable things that life brings my way. I might sit down and try and focus the young Robert Williscroft a little bit more on those things that would have made it easier for him to transition into the life that he eventually led. But as I said, setting that aside, if virtually anything had happened differently, I wouldn't be where I am now, and I'm kind of happy where I am right now.
So just let it go. Once again, just let it go and see what happens. We keep on coming back to the merry-go-round of life.
You have a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah. Again, though, I emphasize you got to prepare. You have to garner as much information, real information, not fake information, as much real knowledge as you physically can, because at some point, somewhere, somehow, that little piece of knowledge is going to save your life.
Perfect advice to leave you with. So, Dr. Robert, for all the people out there who have listened today, what's the number one best way that our audience can connect with you?
You can Google my last name, Williscroft, Williscroft, or you can go to my website, robertwilliscroft.com. That will take you to my books and my adventures and all kinds of stuff, even a slideshow from the South Pole.
We'll have all the links on the show notes. Dr. Robert, thank you so much for spending time with us today, joining up those dots. And please come back again when you've got more dots to join up, because I do believe that by joining up the dots and connecting our past is the best way to build our futures. Dr. Robert, thank you so much.
It has been my pleasure.
Dr. Robert Williscroft. Well, I hope it didn't come out that I was the most stupid person on earth at times like that. I'm not that knowledgeable on things like quantum physics, but certainly I think the key thing to that kept on coming out time and time again is it's great to be creative with your decisions and just live life off the cuff, but preparation is key. If you can bring the two of those together, then you're really going to do some amazing stuff. You can go for the opportunities that occur, but you've already got the knowledge and the background to make sure that those opportunities go the way that you want. And I think that's the way that life should operate. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Join Up Dots, and we will be back again soon. See ya. Bye-bye.
David doesn't want you to become a faded version of the brilliant self you were once to become. So he's put together an amazing guide for you called the 8 Pieces of Advice That Every Successful Entrepreneur Practices, including the 2 that changed his life. Head over to joinupdots.com to download this amazing guide for free, and we'll see you tomorrow on Join Up Dots.